At 6:45 on a Wednesday morning, my father-in-law called to inform me that my wife had passed away in her sleep. He then informed me that she had left her entire estate to him. My wife was seated directly across from me, buttering a slice of rye bread without a care in the world. He stared at her, then at my phone, and thought to myself, this breakfast just became incredibly complicated. Harold's voice crackled through the speaker. Rebecca died last night. I'm so sorry, Michael. She left everything to me. The house, the investments, her life insurance. You received nothing. Becca, my very much alive wife, paused mid-bite. She raised one eyebrow and set down her knife with deliberate care. He placed a single finger against my lips, signaling her to remain silent. Before I could formulate any kind of response, I heard Eleanor in the background, my father-in-law's sister. She let out a sharp, satisfied laugh and declared, finally, that man is out of the picture. Something inside my chest went cold and still. He pressed the speakerphone button and placed my phone flat on the kitchen table between our plates. Harold began outlining his plans to visit later that afternoon to secure Rebecca's property. He suggested I should start packing immediately because there was no point in dragging things out unnecessarily. Across from me, Becca deliberately placed her fork against her plate with a soft clink. Harold, she said calmly. Silence stretched between us like a wire about to snap. Then Becca leaned toward the phone, her voice steady and clear. Before you start dividing up my belongings, Dad, would you mind if I finished my toast first? He heard Eleanor mutter something unintelligible. The line went dead. Becca stared at the phone for what felt like an eternity. Neither of us spoke. The refrigerator hummed in the corner. Through the kitchen window, I could see our neighbor walking his dog, and the normalcy of that image felt almost surreal. Finally, Becca broke the silence. He sounded disappointed, she said quietly. That simple observation hurt her more than any mention of money ever could. He could see it in the way her shoulders sagged slightly. Becca was 67 then, and retirement had not been especially kind to her. She had sold her architectural firm 4 years earlier after 33 years of designing buildings, managing projects, and returning home with tired eyes and aching wrists. Once she stopped working, the weight had crept up on her, nearly 30 pounds. Her right knee had been replaced and still ached whenever the weather changed. Her blood pressure had become unpredictable. One of her medications made her dizzy if she rose too quickly from her chair. There were mornings when the woman who once personally reviewed blueprints for office towers needed me to help her put on her compression socks. She joked about it most days. But 2 nights before Harold's call, Becca had experienced chest discomfort while we were watching the evening news. I had driven her to St. Vincent Hospital in Carmel, where they kept her overnight because her heart rhythm was concerning. She had come home Monday afternoon. Tired, irritated, and convinced that hospital food was some form of cruel punishment. That should have been the end of it. But later, we learned that our next-door neighbor Tom had left Harold a voicemail after seeing the ambulance. Your daughter had another episode, he had said. Michael took her to the hospital. Didn't this sound promising? Harold had called the hospital that night. He wasn't listed as Becca's emergency contact, so nobody shared any details with him. By the next morning, Becca had already been discharged. Apparently, he had called her room and been told she wasn't there anymore. What he did not do was call me and ask, is Rebecca okay? It went straight to Rebecca is dead. And then straight to everything belongs to me. That part troubled me more than I wanted to admit. Becca pushed her plate away with a heavy sigh. How does he even know what my will says? I had an answer, but I didn't want to give it to her. 3 weeks earlier, I had walked into Becca's home office and found Harold crouched beside the lower filing cabinet. He stood up too quickly when he heard me enter. Oh, hi there, Michael. He was just looking for some old insurance documents. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. He had let it go. For 17 years, I had worked extremely hard not to become the suspicious second husband. Becca's first husband, Richard, had passed away from a heart attack long before I met her. Harold had been an adult when we married, and I never tried to replace her father. For a long time, Harold and I had actually gotten along reasonably well. Then Becca retired. Her health shifted, and Harold's questions shifted right along with them. How much did Rebecca get when she sold the firm? Did she ever sell that commercial property? Whose name is on the house now? Becca always had an explanation. He's just curious. He worries about me. It's my father. So I stopped pushing. That morning, I wished I hadn't. At exactly 8:03, Becca's cell phone rang. Her attorney, David Chun. Becca answered. Morning, David. There was a pause. Then Becca's expression shifted. No. I'm sitting in my kitchen, having breakfast. Another pause. He watched her straighten in her chair. David had received a call that morning from someone claiming Becca had died. Worse, that person had mentioned the date of a will Becca had signed 14 years earlier, long before she married me. Under that old will, Harold really would have inherited almost everything. When Becca hung up, she looked toward the hallway where her office was. Then at me. He wasn't grieving for me, she said quietly. I didn't answer. She swallowed hard. He was waiting for me to die. David wanted us in his office immediately. Becca stood up slowly, favoring her bad knee. Her breakfast sat untouched on the table. And for the first time that morning, I realized Harold's phone call might not have been the actual problem. It might have been the mistake that exposed a much larger one. David Chen's office was located near Keystone at the Crossing, about 20 minutes from our house. He drove. That mattered more to Becca than she cared to acknowledge. For most of our marriage, she had driven everywhere. Road trips, dinners, doctor's appointments, even the short distance to the grocery store. She liked being behind the wheel. But after her knee surgery and the dizzy spells from her medication, I had gradually become the driver. That morning, she sat in the passenger seat of her own SUV, staring blankly through the windshield. You okay? He asked. I'm apparently deceased, Michael. eBay had better Wednesdays. He smiled, but she didn't. David was waiting when we arrived. He was 59, silver-haired, meticulous with his words, and had handled Becca's business and estate documents for years. He closed his office door and placed a thick folder on the conference table. First things first, he said. You're obviously still alive. Becca looked down at herself. That's a solid start. David almost smiled. Then he opened the folder. The old will was exactly where it should have been. Becca had signed it 14 years earlier, before we married. Harold was the primary beneficiary. There was a charitable donation to the local children's hospital, but most of the estate would have gone directly to him. Becca stared at the pages. He saw this, David said carefully. I can't prove that, but whoever called this morning knew its exact date. What Harold apparently did not know was that the document had been replaced 6 years earlier. Becca's current estate plan was nothing like the old one. He had protection if she died first. He could remain in our home. My retirement fund stayed mine. Harold would still inherit a substantial amount, and Becca had created education trusts for her grandchildren. Nobody had cut Harold out entirely. He simply wasn't getting everything. Becca leaned back in her chair. He thought Michael would lose the house. David folded his hands. If he believed the old will was still controlling, yes. Becca looked at me. He thought you'd be packing boxes before my obituary was even printed. There wasn't much I could say to that. Then David gave us the part we hadn't expected. Harold and Eleanor had visited his office 8 months earlier. Together? He asked. Together. They hadn't asked directly about Becca's estate. David would never have discussed it with them anyway. Instead, They had asked what happened when an aging parent became incapable of managing finances. Guardianship, powers of attorney, who could take over accounts, whether an adult child could step in if a spouse was making questionable decisions. My stomach tightened. I remembered Thanksgiving. Eleanor had been standing in our kitchen with a glass of wine while Becca struggled to access an account on her phone. Eleanor had laughed and said, "One of these days, we're going to have to take those passwords away from you, Becca." Everybody had laughed, including me. Sitting in David's office, it didn't sound funny anymore. On the drive home, Becca kept defending Harold. Maybe he had panicked. Maybe Eleanor had put ideas in his head. Maybe he genuinely believed the worst after hearing about the hospital. Finally, I pulled into a diner because neither of us had eaten much. We sat near the window with coffee and soup. "Becca," I said gently, "believing you that doesn't explain why he already knew exactly what he planned to do with the house." She stirred her soup without taking a bite. He immediately regretted saying it so sharply. This was her father. He could be furious with him and still understand that she remembered a completely different Harold. The father who had taught her to ride a bike. The parent who had never missed her school plays. The man she had sat beside when her mother died. After a long moment, she said, "Maybe I should call him." "For what? To tell him you've made a miraculous recovery?" I laughed before I could stop myself. She finally smiled. That was Becca. Even on a terrible day, she could usually find one dry little corner of it that was amusing. The smile didn't last long. Harold and Eleanor arrived at our house around 4 o'clock that afternoon. Harold came through the door with tears in his eyes. He hugged Becca tightly. "Oh my God, sweetheart, I'm so sorry. The hospital wouldn't tell me anything. He thought you were gone." Becca stood stiffly in his embrace. "You could have called Michael." Harold stepped back. I wasn't thinking clearly. Eleanor jumped in. We were scared out of our minds. He almost asked which part frightened her enough to laugh about throwing me out, but I kept my mouth shut. Then the conversation shifted. Slowly at first. Eleanor mentioned Becca's driving. Harold brought up the duplicate electric bill Becca had paid several months earlier. Then her medication. Then the time she had forgotten an appointment. Finally, Harold said, "Sweetheart, we're worried about you." Becca's expression hardened. "About me? Or about my money?" "Don't do that, Becca. I'm asking because I care." Harold looked at me. "That's exactly what I mean. Ever since Michael started handling everything, I handled things because your daughter had knee surgery," I interrupted. "You control who talks to her now." He actually laughed. "I'm standing right here, Harold. So is she." He ignored me completely. We spoke to an attorney. Becca went quiet. "About what?" Harold took a breath. "Guardianship." The word changed everything in the room. Becca stared at him. "You want a judge to decide whether I can manage my own life?" "It's not like that, sweetheart." "That sounds exactly like that." Harold reached toward her. "Becca, I already lost your mother. I'm not going to stand around while somebody else controls everything you built." There it was. 17 years of resentment compressed into one single sentence. This wasn't only about money. Some part of Harold still saw me as the man who had stepped into a space that belonged to his daughter's first husband. Maybe fear of losing Becca had turned into fear of losing what she owned. He couldn't tell anymore. They left 20 minutes later. The next morning, someone knocked on our front door. A process server stood on the porch. Becca read the first page twice before sitting down heavily at the kitchen table. Harold had filed. She rubbed both hands over her face. He really wants a court to say I can't take care of myself. He sat beside her. Yesterday, Harold had tried to inherit from a dead woman. Now he was trying to take control of a living one. And this time, he had paperwork. Patricia Okonkwo didn't waste time trying to make us feel better. That was one of the reasons I liked her. She was an elder law attorney in Indianapolis, probably in her early 50s, with reading glasses hanging from a thin chain around her neck and the kind of calm voice that made you listen. She read Harold's petition while Becca and I sat across from her. Then she closed the folder. "Don't dismiss this because it sounds insulting," she said. "We take it seriously, answer it carefully, and document absolutely everything." Becca shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "I'm not incompetent." "I didn't say you were." "My father did." Patricia nodded. "And now we show the court why he's wrong." The problem was, Harold hadn't filled his petition with obvious lies. That would have been much easier. He used facts. Becca had recently been hospitalized for concerning heart symptoms. She'd had knee replacement surgery. Her medications had changed several times. She'd forgotten a cardiology appointment the previous winter. There was also the minor incident at the hardware store. Becca had backed her SUV into a display of potted plants. Nobody was hurt. The vehicle got a small scratch. At the time, we had laughed about it. Harold called it evidence of declining judgment. Then there was the duplicate utility bill. Becca had paid it online, forgotten, and paid it again 2 days later. At 45, that would have been called a simple mistake. At 67, apparently, it belonged in a court filing. Over the next couple of weeks, Patricia had us gather medical records, account statements, and anything else that documented how Becca actually lived. The worst part for her was the cognitive evaluation. He sat nearby while a specialist asked her questions that would have seemed almost insulting under normal circumstances. "What day is it? Where are we? Remember these words. Do the subtraction. Explain how you pay your household bills." Becca answered carefully. She did well. When we walked back to the parking lot, I expected her to be relieved. Instead, she stood beside the SUV with her hand on the door and stared at the pavement. "What?" he asked. She shook her head slowly. "When I was 45, forgetting somebody's name meant I was tired." He waited. "At 67, somebody writes it down on a clipboard." That was when I understood what Harold had really taken from her. It wasn't money, not yet. He had made her self-conscious about being older. Every stiff step. Every forgotten password. Every time she asked me to drive. All of it became something she wondered if other people were noticing and judging. And I wasn't spared either. Harold's filing suggested I had isolated Becca and influenced her into changing her estate plan. One afternoon at the grocery store, I saw Richard's sister near the bread aisle. She spotted me. Then she suddenly became very interested in the cereal section. A few days later, a man from church asked me quietly, "How's Becca doing mentally?" He went home furious. Becca was sitting in her recliner watching a basketball game replay. He wanted to tell her what had happened. He didn't. She already had enough weighing on her. Then Patricia found the money. Ironically, she found it because Harold had claimed Becca's finances were becoming disorganized. Patricia went through several years of account activity. The first questionable transfers started around Becca's knee surgery. Back then, she could barely get down the stairs. She was taking pain medication, going to physical therapy, and depending on everybody more than she liked. She had given Harold temporary access to help with certain bills. He remembered it clearly. At the time, it had seemed completely reasonable. Patricia spread several pages across her desk. "There's roughly $215,000 here that concerns me." Becca blinked. "What?" So much of it was straightforward. Transfers. Payments. Money that eventually landed in accounts connected to Eleanor's business. About $195,000 could be followed with reasonable confidence. Another $20,000 or so had moved through withdrawals and transactions that were much harder to trace. He pointed to those. So what happens to that part? Patricia looked at me. We may never be able to prove exactly where every dollar went. But knowing and proving aren't always the same thing. I hated that sentence. Becca barely spoke. 4 years earlier, she had openly loaned Harold and Eleanor $95,000 when Eleanor's business was struggling. That loan wasn't a secret. Becca had even joked that she was becoming the family bank. But this was different. He never gave them another $100,000, she said firmly. Patricia tapped one document. Then we need to talk about this. She turned it toward Becca. There was her signature at the bottom. He looked at her. She looked at me. Is that yours? Patricia asked. Becca picked up the paper. Her face changed. Yes. No hesitation. No accusation of forgery. That's my signature. The document had been signed shortly after her knee surgery. It gave Harold limited authority to handle certain financial matters while she recovered. Becca read it again, then a third time. What if I told him he could help Eleanor? She asked quietly. He felt my stomach tighten. Did you? She looked at me. I don't know. That answer frightened her. He could see it immediately. A forged signature would have been simple. Someone else would have been the villain, and Becca would have been the victim. But this signature was real. That night, she barely ate dinner. Around 9 o'clock, I found her sitting on the edge of the guest room bed. She had an old photograph in her hand. Harold at maybe 50, smiling, with his arm around a young Becca at her college graduation. He used to be so proud of me, she said quietly. He sat beside her. After a long while, she said, maybe he remembers something I don't. He wanted to tell her absolutely not. But I couldn't. I wasn't there for every conversation between them. And for the first time since this whole nightmare started, I wondered whether we might be wrong about part of it. The next evening, Patricia called. He answered in the kitchen. Michael. Yes. I finished reviewing that authorization. My hand tightened around the phone. Harold did have authority. He closed my eyes. Then Patricia added, but not for what he did. Patricia asked us to come in the next morning. She had the authorization laid out on her conference table with yellow tabs stuck along the edges. The signature is real, she said. And Harold did have permission to act for you during your recovery. Becca nodded. We established that. But permission has boundaries. Patricia slid the document toward her. Harold had been authorized to pay Becca's medical bills, handle household expenses, move money between her own accounts, and take care of certain transactions for her benefit while she recovered from surgery. Patricia tapped one paragraph. What I don't see is permission to finance Eleanor's business. Becca leaned closer. It isn't there. She pulled out another sheet. I also don't see permission to pay their personal credit cards, contribute toward renovations on their house, or make cash withdrawals unrelated to your expenses. He looked at Becca. She didn't look relieved. That surprised me. For days, she had been terrified that she'd forgotten giving Harold permission. Now we knew she hadn't, not in any meaningful sense. But the truth was worse in another way. Harold hadn't forged her trust. He had used it. Becca had handed her father a key because she couldn't get around after surgery, and he had quietly started opening doors she never intended him to touch. On the drive home, she said almost nothing. That evening, things finally boiled over between us. She was standing at the kitchen counter looking through old statements when she said, maybe I still told him he could help Eleanor once or twice. Becca, I'm saying maybe, Michael. We have the paperwork. That doesn't mean we remember every single conversation. He put down the dish towel. What do you want me to tell you? I want somebody to tell me what actually happened. I am telling you what I know. She turned toward me. Everybody is telling me what I know. Harold says I don't remember. Lawyers ask me what I remember. Doctors test what I remember. Her voice rose. And now you're doing it. That's stank. I'm the one person who isn't. She stopped abruptly. He could have told her exactly what she wanted to hear. He could have said, you absolutely never gave him permission. But I didn't know that. And after 17 years of marriage, I wasn't going to comfort her with a lie. She went upstairs. He stayed in the kitchen and washed the same coffee mug twice before realizing what I was doing. We barely spoke for the rest of the night. 2 days later, Patricia called with something else. During the exchange of records, her office had received older text messages between Harold and Eleanor. One of them explained a lot. Eleanor had written, Becca won't take this public. She'd rather eat the loss than tell everybody her own father took money. Harold's response was shorter. She always forgives me. Becca read those words at Patricia's office. Then she read them again. He watched something change in her face. Not anger exactly. Recognition. For years, whenever Harold got himself into trouble, Becca had helped him. When he ran up credit card debt in his 60s, she had helped. When he needed money after his second divorce, she had helped. When Eleanor's business nearly collapsed, Becca had loaned them $95,000. Harold and Eleanor hadn't necessarily believed their tracks were perfect. They believed it didn't matter. Becca would never embarrass her father publicly. She would swallow the loss, keep the family peace, protect Harold from the consequences. Becca placed the paper back on Patricia's desk. That's what they got wrong. It was the first time since the petition arrived that she sounded like herself. Still, getting her confidence back took more than one good sentence. Becca had stopped going to her Thursday breakfast with the women she used to work with. She claimed she wasn't hungry. He knew better. She thought everyone had heard about the guardianship case. One Thursday morning, I dropped her shoes beside her recliner. Get dressed. She looked over her reading glasses. Why? We're going to Bob Evans. I'm not hungry. Good. Their portions are too big anyway. She stared at me. Is this part of my rehabilitation? Yes. Biscuits and public exposure. That got a laugh. So we went. And you know what happened? Nothing. Nobody asked Becca what year it was. Nobody tested her memory. Her old colleague complained about property taxes. Another woman argued about the colds. So my body spent 10 minutes explaining why her new hearing aids were supposedly ruining her life. Becca sat there drinking mediocre coffee and being treated like an ordinary 67-year-old woman. It did more for her than I expected. After that, she made a decision about her estate. Not an angry one. Harold wasn't completely disinherited. The grandchildren's education trust stayed intact under an independent trustee. He remained protected in the house. Harold would never again have authority over Becca's finances, and any eventual share he received would account for money proven to have been improperly taken. Eleanor received nothing. My grandkids didn't do this, Becca said simply. That was all. Then Harold's attorney sent Patricia a settlement proposal. Harold would withdraw the guardianship petition if Becca removed me from certain financial roles, appointed Harold to manage her affairs, and agreed not to pursue the disputed transfers. Patricia finished reading and looked across the table. "Well," she said, "that clears up any remaining mystery." Becca actually laughed. The guardianship hearing was set for the Hamilton County Government and Judicial Center in Noblesville. The night before, Becca laid out a new blazer. The next morning, her fingers were stiff, so I helped with one cuff. She looked embarrassed. "I didn't mention it. He thinks getting old made me easy," she said. "What are you going to do about it?" Becca reached for her cane. "Show up." And that was exactly what Harold wasn't expecting. Harold was already inside the courtroom when we arrived. He had Eleanor beside him and 3 relatives sitting behind them, including Richard's sister, the same woman who'd avoided me at the grocery store. He understood why they were there. Harold had spent weeks telling people the same story. His daughter was declining, her husband controlled her, and he was only trying to protect her. Then Becca walked in with her cane. Not looking 20 years younger. Not pretending her knee didn't hurt. Used Becca. Harold looked at her, then quickly looked away. His attorney started with Becca's health. The hospitalization. The knee replacement. The medication. The missed cardiology appointment. Even the potted plant incident at the hardware store made another appearance. Becca answered without trying to make herself look perfect. "Jeez, I forgot the appointment. Jeez, Michael drives more than I do. Jeez, sometimes I walk into a room and forget why I went in there." Harold's attorney glanced toward the judge. Becca added, "My knee is bad. My hearing isn't what it used to be. None of that means my father owns me." He saw Patricia hide the smallest smile. Then came the document I'd been dreading. Harold's attorney produced the financial authorization. He walked Becca through it carefully. "That is your signature?" "Yes. And you voluntarily gave your father authority to handle certain financial matters?" "Specifically for my recovery, yes." "But you trusted him?" Becca looked at Harold. "I did. For a few minutes, I felt the case sliding away from us. The paper was real. Becca had signed it. Nobody could change that." Then Patricia stood. She didn't dispute a single word. "Yes," she said. MRS, Mercer trusted her father. She asked Harold whether the authorization allowed him to pay Becca's medical expenses. Harold said, "Yes." "Household bills?" "Yes." "Move funds between Becca's accounts for her benefit?" "Yes." Then Patricia changed direction. "Where does it authorize you to transfer her money into your sister's business?" Harold hesitated. "It gave me financial authority." "That wasn't my question." Silence. Patricia asked about payments toward Harold and Eleanor's credit cards, then money connected to renovations on their house. Then the withdrawals that had nothing to do with Becca's medical care or household expenses. Harold's attorney objected to parts of it, and the judge kept Patricia focused. That actually made the whole thing feel more serious. No dramatic speeches. Used numbers and documents. Patricia didn't claim we could prove every dollar either. About $195,000 could be connected with reasonable confidence to transactions outside the purpose Becca had authorized. Another $20,000 or so had moved through cash withdrawals and other activity that was too muddy to pin down cleanly. He was glad she admitted that. The truth wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. Then Becca described the phone call. She told the judge exactly what she'd heard Harold say that Wednesday morning. My dad died last night. He left everything to me. You get nothing. Harold shook his head. He was confused. He thought she was dead. Becca looked at him. You thought I was dead? You weren't confused about what you wanted afterward. That was the first moment Harold started to lose his composure. He insisted Eleanor had handled many of the transactions. Eleanor turned toward him. You knew what we were doing. Harold's face changed. I knew what you told me. You said Becca wouldn't notice half of it. Eleanor's voice rose. Don't you dare, you said it. You said she always forgives you. Harold was crying now. The courtroom went silent. Eleanor's face was pale. Even her attorney seemed to realize what had just happened about 2 seconds too late. The judge called for order. After that, the room felt different. Near the end, Becca was allowed to speak about her wishes and her relationship with Harold. She rested both hands on the handle of her cane. You thought I was weak because I got old, she said. Harold started crying again. Becca didn't raise her voice. I know I'm slower. Michael drives when I don't feel steady. He helps me with things I used to do myself. Sometimes I forget names. Sometimes my knee hurts so badly I don't want to leave the house. She paused. Needing help from my husband doesn't make me my father's property. Harold wiped his face. Becca looked down for a second before continuing. The money hurt. These court papers hurt. But that wasn't the worst part. She looked directly at him. The worst part was hearing how happy you sounded when you thought I was dead. Nobody moved. He'd been angry with Harold for weeks. In that moment, I wasn't. He just felt terribly sad for Becca. The guardianship petition failed. There was no movie-style arrest afterward. Nobody put Eleanor in handcuffs outside the courtroom. Patricia explained that the disputed money was a separate matter. The guardianship case is over, she told us. The money isn't. That was good enough. Outside the courthouse, Harold caught up with me. Becca and Patricia were several steps ahead. You turned her against me, Harold said. He looked at him. There were 100 cruel things I could have said. He didn't need any of them. Harold, your daughter was sitting beside me when you celebrated her death. He didn't have to turn her against anybody. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Becca came through the doors behind us, leaning a little heavier on her cane than she had that morning. He went to her. You okay? She exhaled. Tired. Then she glanced back at the courthouse. For a dead woman, I think I did pretty well. He laughed. So did she. And after weeks of doctors, lawyers, accusations, and people deciding what Becca could or couldn't do, we walked to our SUV at exactly her pace. Nobody hurried her. Winning in court didn't fix our family. I think that surprised Becca. For months, Harold barely spoke to her. No Sunday calls. No random pictures of the grandkids. At Thanksgiving, he sent a 2-line text instead of coming over. Becca pretended it didn't bother her. He knew better. One night, I found her sitting at the kitchen table after midnight, turning her phone over in her hands. "Maybe I should have just let the money go," she said. "And the guardianship?" She didn't answer. "That wasn't about money, Becca." "I know. You can forgive somebody without handing them the keys again." She nodded, but slowly. "That was the hard part. Nobody tells you about boundaries. Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't feel good. Sometimes it just hurts differently." The financial dispute took months to settle. We never recovered every dollar. Patricia's office could document roughly $195,000 well enough to pursue, but some cash withdrawals remained too murky. In the end, Harold agreed to repay a substantial portion over time rather than keep fighting. Becca accepted it. Eleanor's business didn't survive the following year. Not because Becca destroyed it. That distinction mattered to me. Becca simply stopped rescuing them. Eleanor eventually took a salaried job. Harold went back to part-time work. They sold their oversized house and moved into a smaller place. For years, whenever Harold fell, Becca had quietly put a cushion underneath him. "This time," she stepped back. Gravity did the rest. She never punished the grandchildren. Their education trusts remained exactly where they were, except Becca appointed an independent trustee to manage them. "My grandkids didn't do this," she reminded me. A few months later, her oldest granddaughter mailed her a birthday card. Nothing expensive. Used the card with crooked handwriting inside. "Happy birthday, Grandma. I love you." Becca read it at the kitchen counter. Then she put it on the refrigerator with a magnet from our old trip to Gatlinburg. She never mentioned the settlement that day. The card mattered more. Life got ordinary again, which was exactly what we needed. Becca started cardiac rehab and complained about it with impressive consistency. She lost 12 pounds over several months. Her knee still hurt. She still got lightheaded occasionally if she stood too fast. And yes, sometimes I still helped her with her shoes. I wasn't exactly aging backward myself. Years of work, stress, and taking care of other people had changed my body too. There was a time when I looked at old photographs and wondered where that slimmer man had gone. Eventually, I stopped asking. He hadn't gone anywhere. He had simply lived another 17 years. About 8 months after the hearing, Harold asked Becca to meet him for coffee. Alone. He told her to go. When she came home, I didn't ask questions right away. She hung her jacket up, poured herself water, and finally sat across from me. "Well," he apologized. He waited. "Good apology?" She made a face. "Started out terrible." He laughed. Harold blamed Eleanor at first. Then Dad. Stress. His fear after losing his wife. His resentment toward me. But eventually, he said something honest. "I started thinking of what you had as something that was already mine." Becca told me she sat there for a while before answering. Then she said, "You started inheriting me before I was gone." That was the sentence Harold finally seemed to understand. Becca didn't restore his access to her accounts. He didn't become her power of attorney. There were no dramatic hugs and promises that everything would be the way it used to be. It couldn't be. But they started talking again. Carefully. Sometimes forgiveness is a door you open 6 inches instead of throwing wide. That was enough. One Saturday morning, months later, Becca and I were sitting at the same kitchen table where this whole mess had started. Her pill organizer was beside the napkin holder. He was drinking coffee. Becca was buttering toast. Then my phone rang. We both looked at it. Becca pointed her butter knife toward me. You answer it. Why? Last time we got a call before breakfast, I found out I was dead. Ismail. Technically, I answered that call too. She thought about it, then nodded. See. Memory's still good. He laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. And strangely enough, that ordinary morning felt more like winning than the courthouse ever had. We were older, slower, a little heavier, a little more careful going downstairs. But we were still here. Still making our own decisions. Still sitting at our own table. A hint can take some speed from you. It can change your body and shape your confidence. But it doesn't give anyone, not even family, the right to take your dignity along with it. If you've ever had to set a boundary with someone you still loved, then you probably know why this was harder than it looked. Sometimes protecting yourself and loving someone have to exist at the same time. Thanks for listening to our story. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming and thought-provoking tales. Share your thoughts in the comments below, we'd love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss an upload. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.